everyone, I'm Elias Martin of CollectingJapanesePrints.com, and welcome to Woodblock Wednesday, where every Wednesday we get together and discuss Japanese prints, paintings, history, and culture. It's been a little bit of time since I did my last Woodblock Wednesday. Thank you, all of you, for your emails and messages and for your patience. I've been really busy with an exhibition that I just launched a couple weeks ago. I have over 160 new prints and paintings added to my website, collectingjapaneseprints.com. I invite all of you to have a look. It's basically a collection of prints from all genres, from ukiyo-e, shinhanga, sosakuhanga, and contemporary, as well as Western artists working in Japan. I think there's something for everyone at every price point. So again, if you're interested in prints and paintings, I'd recommend going on the site and having a good look around. I also do a lot of research on the prints and paintings that I offer, and so the information listed on my site might be helpful to you, even if you're just interested in learning more about prints and paintings. Now, having said all that, I picked out a wonderful set of two pieces today to discuss on Woodblock Wednesday. These two pieces come from this current new exhibition. And so without further ado, let's go to table and have a look. Okay, here we are. We have two wonderful pieces to discuss today. They're both by the artist Kawase Hasui. And for those of you who are not familiar with him, he's considered one of the top shinhanga artists. Hasui worked with Watanabe, the publisher. Essentially, Watanabe invented or established shinhanga, and he discovered Hasui along with several shinhanga artists Shinsui, Hasui. He worked with Goyo, he worked with Hiroshi Yoshida, and so the list goes on. And Watanabe hiring Hasui early on, basically that collaboration lasted for Hasui's entire artistic career. In this particular design, it's titled Nishimikawazaka. It is from 1921. Here, I'll come in a little closer so you can see the design. This woodblock print was done in 1921, so it's a very rare pre-earthquake design. And again, for those of you who are not familiar, there was an earthquake in Japan, in Tokyo, in 1923. And that earthquake and the ensuing fires destroyed a large portion of Tokyo, including Watanabe's print shop and studio. In fact, tragically, one of Watanabe's prized master printers was killed in the aftermath. And so pre-earthquake prints are considered by many connoisseurs, collectors, and curators as they represent some of Hasui's most important designs, and not just because of the compositions, but because of how they're printed. And Watanabe losing one of his master printers, it was a tragic loss because it takes about 20 years of apprenticeship to become a master printer. And so losing a master printer, Watanabe was at a great disadvantage. And though I don't think that the prints after the earthquake suffered due to the quality, I do think, though, that there's something was lost. So maybe like an if I could even quantify it in those terms, the bokashi, the gradation of color, being bokashi, and other really subtle print effects how do I put it? The prints after the earthquake they just don't hit the same in most cases. And I can't really quantify it in words that come off as, to explain it. It's just something, a je ne sais quoi, if I could put it in those terms, and how pre-earthquake Hasui prints appear versus the later post-earthquake impressions. But in this case, this is one early pre-earthquake snow scene, and Hasui is really known for his snow scene. So having a pre-earthquake snow scene is really wonderful. And in this case, we could see the wonderful bokashi, as well as the way that the snow has been rendered all across the design. It's quite effective. The atmospheric quality of this design is really strong, and this particular impression is quite striking and beautiful. And so what's also noteworthy is that this print comes along in our conversation today with the original watercolor. And as you might imagine, watercolors by Hasui are quite rare. However, this being a pre-earthquake design makes this watercolor one of maybe a couple known examples done in the pre-earthquake period. So perhaps there might be one or two other watercolors that match the designs that have survived. But in this case, this watercolor did survive, and it is the preliminary work that was produced to create this design. Now, I should point out that Hasui is known to have produced watercolors after designs he made for Watanabe, and those pieces were commissioned pieces by collectors who probably really loved that design and had that design in their collections, and commissioned Hasui to produce a watercolor after the fact. And we know that he did that because those watercolors are on different paper. They are also sealed with a squarish seal. And in this case, this design, you could see where the signature is. Let me move over. There is Hasui's signature. It does not have the red seal. And it's on the kind of paper he would use as a preliminary work to figure out the composition. And the other thing I should point out is that typically these watercolors that were produced after the fact are faithful reproductions of the design that you would find in the woodblock print. However, in this case, this watercolor is really valuable, not just because it's a beautiful, rare work that's original to the artist, but also it shows us the artistic process at work. Here in the corner, we're missing something. So in the finished print, we have this beautiful tree. It's a pine, and the limbs and the pines are covered completely in snow. You could see all that. And it anchors the composition. Honestly, it's a really good addition to the design. Whereas in the original work, that's missing. It's much more open. But I think what happened is Watanabe looked at the original watercolor and thought it needed a little bit more of an oomph. Like the anchoring of the way that the pine anchors the composition, it makes it tighter, but it also amplifies the atmospheric quality. We have a contrast of white with the gray of the pine trees covered in snow that gives a certain sense of depth, and it breaks up the blue, and it adds a little bit more of a contrast to the blue, though we do have the snowflakes above the water. But here, you see, it's much more open, though this work has its charm as well. But it's interesting to see the artistic process at work where Hasui designed something, and then we see Watanabe adding his personal touch to the design. Usually these changes were made by Watanabe, And sometimes what would happen is Watanabe would tell Hasui to redo the work, and another watercolor would be produced with the change, or at the very least, a sketch that could be used to produce the wood block. And in this case, I don't know if there was a secondary sketch that was produced after this original work. And if it was, it might have been sacrificed in the process of carving out the block. The sketch could have been easily copied directly with a tracing paper from this original watercolor. And then the tree element could have been added at the last minute. And that sketch, being on sort of a tracing like paper, was placed directly onto the block of wood that then the woodblock carver would use to carve the blocks. So that's sort of a look into the process. Now, I want to point out that these two pieces, it's extraordinarily rare to find a pre-earthquake Hasui print. I mean, this print is quite rare, but it's almost unheard of to be able to examine a pre-earthquake watercolor, particularly a snow scene by Hasui. I mean, this is as good as it gets in terms of rarity and also a beauty, because this design is quite beautiful. And I should point out that this watercolor is available. It is in my current exhibition of over 150 new works on my website. I have other original paintings, not just by Hasui, but I have some by Obata and by Onchi, as well as other artists. So if you haven't visited my website, I encourage all of you to go, collectingjapaneseprints.com. Now, I talked a lot about the history, the background of how these prints are made, and how these watercolors were included into the process. Now let's just have a look close. Let's just have a closer look. You can see how beautiful this piece is. There are some subtle changes in terms of the watercolor versus the finished print. For example, the figure. You see, he's more in, I'm assuming it's a male carrying an umbrella. The figure is in brownish tones, and when we look at the figure in the finished print, it's yellow. And that figure, you see the travelers in straw there are these outer coats made out of straw. And that's very typical, that yellow. You see that in a few other Hasui prints of travelers traversing the landscapes with snow. But it also, for print collectors, it recalls the work of Hiroshige in certain snow scenes that he produced with travelers in the same yellowish straw outfits. And so there is a connection to the traditional woodblock prints of the ukiyo-e period by Hiroshige. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's a deliberate connection that Watanabe wanted to make. Now, the other thing I want to point out, in the original watercolor, we see some brownish, yellowish tones throughout the landscape here in the sort of in the hills and the cliffs, a little hill area, and the shading's a little bit different. And here it's mostly tones of gray and white, which is effective. But to be honest, I kind of like the original. I like it a bit more than the woodblock print. I think the yellowish brown adds something to the composition that gives it even more depth and more visual interest. But I can kind of see, in terms of a woodblock print, simplifying the colors to make the snow appear that much more dramatic. And I get that. And in the print, those changes make the print very successful. And as a watercolor, these qualities that we find in this original work make the watercolor very successful. But it's interesting because as a publisher, Watanabe had to figure out, well, this watercolor looks great, but how does it translate as a woodblock print? And so he had to really come to terms with what kind of decisions needed to be made in order to make a very successful woodblock print design. So I'm going to zoom in so you could see the qualities that make this woodblock print successful. And one of those is this really wonderful atmospheric quality in the printing. There's a sort of this smoky quality on the surface where you can see the white of the snow merging into the gray of the sky. And of course, every snowflake is carved in a irregular circular form, which gives the woodblock print a wonderful sense of rhythm, actually. Now the watercolor has that quality, but it's actually, the snow is more subdued in the watercolor. And it works in this composition. I think the watercolor, if I were to own one Hasui watercolor, I think I would keep this one. I mean, this is fantastic. It being such an early, important work, and because it's a snow scene. But I think it's also valuable because all of us who are big fans of Hasui woodblock prints, we've seen them. We've seen them in books and museums, or some of us are fortunate enough to own them. And they all have a very kind of similar quality to how they appear in person as woodblock prints. But when you see an original watercolor, there is something very different about this work, which I hope translates well onto the screen. It's very hard to capture on my phone. I'm looking at my phone and then I'm looking at the original work in front of me. There's a difference. And in person, this watercolor, it's just wonderful. I think it's just a presence that the work has that it's kind of hard to translate or even explain. So I'm going to zoom in so you can carefully observe all of these wonderful elements within this composition. And then we have the original writing in the margins. Oh, I should point out to you that this watercolor is discussed in the book Water and Shadow. The book is an exhibition of Hasui prints. It's an exhibition catalog that was produced, I'd say, about 5 years ago or so. You can find it. In fact, I have some available for sale. I just don't have it out here with me. But yeah, this watercolor has been exhibited and it's been illustrated in that catalog as well as discussed. It's a very well-known watercolor with excellent provenance. Now, this woodblock print is not available for sale. It belongs to a private collector, and I was fortunate enough for him to let us borrow, let us borrow this piece for our conversation today. I'm going to zoom in. Let's see how beautifully well carved, how articulated each snowflake is across the composition. It's an amazing feat to be able to, imagine you're the woodblock carver and you have to carve all these little dots of snow. And they're spaced out in a way where they look natural. And like I said, there's like a pulse in how they're rendered across the surface of the composition. Now, I wanted to point out the size. Let me see if I can. Sorry about the camera being a little shaky. I'm trying to do this with one hand. This watercolor, I think, is roughly the same size as the woodblock print. And that's important because, yeah, it's actually about the exact same size. And I wanted to point that out because a lot of the Hasui watercolors that were produced after the fact, after the design was done, those watercolors tend to be much larger. And they're on a larger sheet of paper, they're on a thicker sheet of paper. And for pieces that were used for the production of the print, they're almost exact. They're almost exact in size, and that obviously that's because they're being produced to produce the woodblock print, but they also exhibit some subtle differences, as in this case not so subtle. The entire tree is missing. I mean, I can stand in front of these two prints and just go on and on. I hope all of you are enjoying viewing these prints as much as I am. This print is beautiful in its own way, and it's wonderful to be able to connect it to its original watercolor. And again, this piece is available for sale. Well, I hope you enjoyed our conversation where we've compared an original pre-earthquake Hasui snow scene, a watercolor, with its counterpart, its woodblock printed counterpart. This is a wonderful opportunity to share something so extraordinarily rare. This is the first time I've come across a pre-earthquake watercolor in 28 years of doing this. So it's an extraordinarily rare experience to be able to connect two of these together. So I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today. And I want to point out that my exhibition has quite a few Hasuis. And so I'm going to dedicate another Woodblock Wednesday or two to more of the Hasuis that are in my exhibition. They're so beautiful that I just feel compelled to share them with all of you. But I also have quite a few other things as well. And so in the coming weeks, there'll be plenty of Woodblock Wednesdays dedicated to all sorts of prints by artists from all genres. So there's something to look forward to. So again, if you're interested in learning more about my website and having a look at what I currently have available, my website is collectingjapaneseprints.com. And of course, I'm also interested in buying prints or collections. So if you have prints that you might be interested in selling, feel free to reach out to us through our website, and I'll contact you right back with my offer. So I want to thank all of you for joining me on this installment of Woodblock Wednesday, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, bye-bye.